Ambassador of Jordan to the United States, someone we have all known for years, and Gilad Sher, who's head of the Institute for National Security Studies Center, INSS. I know that's the acronym. The INSS Center for Negotiations in Tel Aviv. Listening to me, I remain bullish on a two-state solution. And if I weren't an optimist, I would never have served 9 terms in the United States Congress, where the prospects for peace are even more daunting. I think there are strong grounds to be an optimist about this, and I want to give you my 4 reasons. First, the peace process is a priority for John Kerry, who has deep personal connections in the Middle East and a solid, at least 25-year-old relationship with Bibi Netanyahu. He says they drank beer in Cambridge. That's all I know about that. Second, President Obama's speech in Jerusalem, I know this is a U.S.-centric set of observations, but hey. President Obama's speech in Jerusalem a month ago dispelled many of the doubts about whether he could relate. He passed the so-called Kishki test with Israelis. Third, the region is stepping up, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this. Think the Arab League's proposal for minor land swaps, which was announced after an Arab League delegation meeting with John Kerry earlier this month. And fourth, notwithstanding the lackluster performance of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the deeply disturbing pending departure of Salam Fayyad in Palestine, there are some good ideas on both sides, and I know they will be discussed today. I really care about the future of Israel in the region, which I traveled to over 25 times as a member of Congress and have been to recently. I'm leaving tomorrow for another trip to Cairo and Doha. I will be on a panel in Doha where I plan to talk about the huge opportunity, let me repeat that, opportunity for the Middle East to become an economic powerhouse. But that only works if there is a two-state solution and reconciliation in the neighborhood. It would be a really good idea for that to happen soon. With that goal in mind, I'm pleased to announce a new partnership between the Wilson Center and the INSS and its Center for Applied Negotiations, headed by Gilad Sher. We're looking forward to collaborating on future projects in the field of negotiations. This and our new partnership with Yalla Israel-Palestine, a young leadership Facebook organization that now has 355,000 members. No kidding. I'm sure Aaron will provide more information. That's part of our plan to expand our reach and go global. Both efforts, the INSS collaboration and the Yalla collaboration, will be directed by our Vice President for New Initiatives. He's not so new, Aaron David Miller, who has been a distinguished scholar here for years, and he will moderate today's discussion. As I mentioned, bios have been distributed, but it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague, Aaron Miller.
Jane, thank you very much. And I respect and appreciate your observations about optimism and pessimism with regard to this process. We're all suffering, I think, from a sort of peace process fatigue, if not exhaustion, in this town. So many panels, so many discussions, so many approaches, so many plans about how to reach a two-state solution and a meaningful negotiation and agreement between Israelis and Palestinians. And, you know, the reasons for why we don't have such an agreement are varied. You take your pick. It's Israel's fault, too many settlements. The Palestinians are weak and divided. The region's a mess. People are focused on Iran. And the president has other priorities. You could pick any one of these or all of them. So the real question for today's session, I thought, is where are we really? There's been a burst of new factors which need to be appreciated and factored into the old wine perhaps in new bottles. You have 2 newly elected leaders, Benjamin Netanyahu and Barack Obama. You have what is tantamount, I'm increasingly believe, is a de facto settlements freeze, at least in the West Bank. You've got the Arab League mobilized around support for land swaps and perhaps other things. You've got a new and energetic Secretary of State who has decided to put himself in the middle of the mix, which is not the sine qua non, but you don't buy a ticket, you don't win the lottery. And John Kerry has decided that he wants to be in the middle of this. And then, of course, we'll see where we go. So I've asked our panelists, who will speak for 10 minutes each. I've given them, by presumption, I suppose, to give the three of them 2 assignments. Number one is to try to describe how the regional situation has either retarded or advanced the prospects for this two-state solution. We would be foolish, naive in the extreme, if we did not factor in the reality that regional developments are now more critical than ever before to this process. You can't hermetically seal it any longer. That may have been true in the 70s. It may actually have been true in the 90s. But you cannot protect the peace process any longer from the realities of what's happening in this region. That's assignment number one. Number two, we know all of the reasons why this shouldn't, can't, and won't work. Question is, what do the 3 parties represented here today, the Israelis, the Palestinians, and Marwan, I put you in the very comfortable position of speaking for the entire world, what is required from each party to not only get to the table, which I suspect will be easier than the second challenge, which is what is required to sustain the parties in a credible process. The Americans are not represented here today. I will, since I can't restrain myself, offer a couple comments at the end about the U.S. role. One additional point. There are no 3 better individuals to deal with this issue. They both have tremendous, formidable analytical power. They're quite capable of detachment. They're not advocating, but more important.
And try to cover all of these issues in 10 minutes, but here, let me start my timer. Regionally speaking, I think it's safe to say common wisdom, and I think it's right to say that the Arab Spring and the developments in the region have created this distraction from the Palestinian issue. It's no longer at the top of the priorities. Look at Syria, look at Egypt, look at everything that's going on. And this is a true issue and a real problem, but it's not the major problem for 2 reasons, really. My own experience tells me that, yes, this issue can become secondary or tertiary, but it has a way of reasserting itself in the order of priorities. So sooner or later, this is going to come back. This is not the first time that external changes have distracted attention. But also, even as we say that, I'm not sure how accurate it is. You mentioned Kerry's energetic engagement. It tells you that even when everything happening, there's a sense of importance and priority for this. But I think the more problematic aspect of the regional developments is the fluidity of the regional architecture and alliances. You can see the beginnings, the outlines of axes being formed. Qatar, Egypt, Turkey, Hamas on one side. To a lesser extent, Jordan, UAE, Saudi, to some extent on another side. These relations are changing all the time. They play differently in different scenes. What is very clear to me that the Arab world right now cannot work as a unit. If you want to really know what King Abdullah of Jordan thinks of Morsi and Erdogan, read his interview to the Atlantic. The Saudis taking over from the Qataris in Syria. All of these things tell you that you have competing interests. And in all of this, the US is trying to figure out a policy towards the region. And sometimes to please some of your allies, you by definition will create tensions with the other allies. So to create an Arab unified, proactive front when it comes to pushing the peace process might be difficult. I think what we saw at the State Department a couple of weeks ago, reaffirming the Arab initiative is as far as we can go with the Arab envelope around it. Abbas, in the meantime, has been indecisive, has been walking the line with both camps, if you wish. He starts the talks in Amman and then jumps to Doha to sign a deal with Hamas, to the chagrin of everyone, I believe. His relations right now are tense with Jordan, with Egypt, with Saudi, with others. So the Palestinians have not yet positioned themselves within this triangle. So this is, in my view, the regional environment that we will be working with. Now to the issue of bringing the sides to the table. Let me start by saying I agree with Aaron. I think the sides will come to the table, or there's a high possibility of the sides coming to the table. I mean, we have to look at why Abbas and the Palestinians are not coming to the table. And I think it's a combination of political and foreign policy issue. Politically, as much as the current situation for President Abbas is not necessarily very comfortable, it is, though, in political terms, quite secure. He has no political competition. Hamas is competition, but Hamas is in Gaza. It's contained in Gaza. Within Fatah and within that, if you wish, secular movement, there is no competition, and frankly, part of it is own doing. Part of it is a crisis of direction in the Palestinian side, but he doesn't have to worry on a day-to-day level about not going to the negotiations. There is no push for him to go to the negotiations domestically, and there's a big political price to be paid if he goes to the negotiations. And frankly, the policy of standing up, if you wish, to the US and to Israel has worked for him in political terms. Regionally speaking, or in a policy, from policy point of view, he doesn't trust Netanyahu. This goes back to the mid-90s, when Netanyahu was prime minister, and this is also has been reaffirmed in the recent interaction between the two men. I suspect it's mutual, by the way, but I'm only talking about the Palestinians here. And so he has very little faith that if he goes to negotiations, they were going to produce something. And frankly, as well, I don't think he believes in the ability of the US or the willingness of the US to deliver. The settlement freeze debacle, whatever you want to call it, has sent a message to the Palestinians and the Israelis that the US might not be able to deliver, and frankly, it is quite cost-free to say no to the US. So there is very little policy or political reason for him to go to the negotiations. So as we talk about how do you bring them to the negotiations, I think we have to address these issues domestically by changing the cost-benefit calculus, by creating incentive to go in, and to start creating some pain if he doesn't go in. What this means in reality, I'm not, there are many ways of configuring it, but this, I assume, is what Kerry is doing now. The US has to show that it can deliver. It will have plenty of opportunities. We're talking about Palestinians and Israelis here. A crisis will happen, and if it doesn't happen, it can easily be engineered, where the US can show that it can bring the sides, or it can impose pain on standing up to the US. Now, bringing to the table is the easier part. Keeping them on the table is the more difficult part. This requires a credible process. A credible process means the ability of the US, from a Palestinian point of view, to deliver Israel, whether, and a big chunk of this will happen in closed rooms, whether in the ability to get Israel to present policy and negotiation positions that are within reason of what we all know the end game would look like. It is also about creating an ongoing, parallel supportive track on the ground to allow Abbas and to allow those who want to negotiate to point to successes, to say that moderation and diplomacy pays. This, in my view, requires the creation, in addition to the bilateral track, Palestinian and Israeli, two parallel tracks, Palestinian-American, Israeli-American. In this track, the US should be pushing the sides, first of all, to refrain from damaging behavior and statements. And I wouldn't underestimate the importance of positive statements, in order to create, as I said, a supportive environment to the negotiations. But also, this track will serve another objective. Because even if we assume that the sides come to the negotiating table with the best of faith, and this is a very long assumption, this is a very iffy assumption when you're dealing with the Middle East, but let's assume that this is the case, the possibility of failure is real. Possibly these two leaders simply cannot agree in policy terms and ideological terms on a common ground on all of the issues. And we might end up to a point of deadlock. It doesn't mean that the US shouldn't be pushing the sides to really go as far as they can, but we have to accept that we might come to a point where there will be deadlock. And in this regard, failure can take many forms. Failure can take a spectacular Camp David style form, in which case, frankly, this kind of failure comes with a price. The idea that it's better to have tried and failed than not tried, I don't buy that. Failure always comes with a price to the participants in the process, a price to the actual substance of the process. The erosion of faith in the two-state solution is, to a large extent, a product of that, and frankly, a price to the U.S. credibility in the region. So we have to look at ways in which failure can be pivoted towards a different process, a different kind of objective. And in this regard, I think we have to look at this parallel line as creating ways that if the negotiations fail, how do we create a process on the ground that will keep some hope alive? And that will be, frankly, by creating and moving on realities on the ground in the form of what has been commonly known as constructive unilateralism, coordinated unilateralism, etc., to show that there is progress, to create a holding pattern, to manage the process. And by the way, management is not a four-letter word. Management can be a very helpful tool in some ways, but to manage the process until the politics changes. Now, the complexity, and I'm going to end with this point, the complexity of doing these management issues and creating change on the ground goes back to Palestinian domestic politics. Traditionally, whenever we conceived of further Israeli unilateral steps, lightening the footprint of the occupation, etc., we've always conceived of it as building on what Salam Fayyad has managed to achieve on the security sector, primarily, but also in the governance and reform sector. Well, Fayyad is out. Fayyad is out, and as far as I can tell, Fayyad has no interest in remaining as Prime Minister. He is adamant on not maintaining that position. He wants to look at his political future in a different forum. He will stay in Palestine, as I understand it, but as a political actor, not as a Prime Minister. But this throws a great challenge to the Palestinians and to others who are interacting. Will the new Palestinian government, will the new Palestinian constellation be able to, and willing, to continue what Fayyad has been doing, to rebuild on the, and to my 10 minutes are done, to amplify on the successes of what Fayyad did, to continue not only a kind of circumstantial security coordination and cooperation, but a deep-seated one? That's a challenge. This is what I think the US should be very actively engaged with the Palestinians. The Arabs should be very actively engaged with the Palestinians to ensure that we continue having that safety net. I fear that if the process fails and we cannot pivot or jump into a new platform, the political reality in Palestine will create two very damaging outcomes. I think it will create an accelerated unity deal, and I believe that this is damaging. And if you have been following the news yesterday, there seems to be an agreement to push the unity government for 3 more months, which will probably coincide with the time when we start seeing the outlines of the success or failure of the process. And it will also push the Palestinians to go back to the UN and to the kind of harder instruments of the UN, be it ICC or what have you, creating yet another crisis. So I think there is hope. I personally am not very hopeful with the possibility of reaching a conflict-ending agreement, but I'm hopeful, if we play it right, that we can actually create a process that is both real, constructive, and will create some stability until maybe the regional and the domestic circumstances change. Thank you very much, and looking forward to the discussion.
Ray, thank you very much. Gilad?
Thank you. Well, I'll recap on what Ray has said. There is a realistic hope, despite the fact that that we can speak for hours here about optimism and the pessimism in the Middle East. I think, Jane, you mentioned President Obama's speech in Israel, and I think that Secretary Kerry follows up his the footsteps of the main pillars of this speech, saying that peace is possible, peace is essential, peace is just, and peace will be achieved only throughout negotiations. And I believe, I humbly agree to all this. I believe that the contour of the end game is well known. Since the Clinton parameters or what have you in between then and now, 13 years later, I think that all we need is to get a process renewed. But we need a real process. We need a process that would be binding, that would be continuous, that would be hands-on, that would have the sophistication of having real deposits, mutual deposits, put in the heads of America by both the Israelis and the Palestinians, and we will have to have some contingency plan, which I will present in a minute. Now, you know, from an Israeli perspective, as an Israeli Zionist Jew, I would like to see Israel as a democratic nation state of the Jewish people for many years, not just as a slogan. And I believe that from Israel's perspective, the two-state solution is imperative. There's no other way we can secure our future as a Jewish and democratic state. And the status quo in that respect is untenable. So it's not a question of assigning blames here, who is to blame and whose fault was it or is it. We need to have a proactive approach, all of us, both the Arab League and the Palestinians, as well as the Israelis and the Americans. We cannot just sit and wait and see that how things develop, because they are never in our control, and they are never developing the way we would like to see them develop on our own. So we need some kind of a policy approach that I would like to describe here. The framework that actually consists of several elements that you mentioned. If I want to have a two-state reality, even in the absence of an agreement yet, of course the main direction of the process should be towards permanent status, towards a permanent status agreement, the final agreement that would provide for the resolution of all the outstanding core issues, as well as the other deriving issues, and the end of conflict, the finality of claims. But that, in my opinion, to be realistic, is not immediately, imminently achievable. So we will have to combine that. Is that working? Sure, right? Okay. So we have negotiations towards permanent status with the long-term agreement, but we do have to have a partial and interim transition period in between, because what could be achievable is a partial or an interim agreement or a phased agreement on borders, on security, on statehood, possibly on economy, and many other issues. And then in a state-to-state fashion, we can continue the negotiations towards permanent status. That's the main pillar of the effort. Now, the second one would be a multilateral regional dialogue, and that relates to your question. What could be done in the regional context nowadays, because the developments in the Middle East, across the Arab world and in the Middle East, are not necessarily just concerning. They are also providing some opportunities. And I believe that the Arab Peace Initiative, recently discussed here in the State Department with Arab League and Qatari leaders, I believe that it provides a basis for further negotiations on the multilateral track, and not just the bilateral Israeli-Palestinian one. And the complementary and alternative contingency for that would be an independent, unilateral, constructive approach that relates to certain things that we can do, and I can elaborate later during the discussion. Both Israelis and Palestinians unilaterally, that do not negate the two-state solution, but rather complement it or alternative to a deadlock in negotiations, and produce a two-state reality, produce a better traction, a positive traction on the ground, rather than just the regular frustration and animosity that we face every day. Now, these constructive steps could be coordinated, should be coordinated, but are not conditioned by being coordinated. They could be taken independently by the parties, and they are both complementary and alternative to one another. So we're talking about a transitional stage in which we are actually starting the binding, continuous process of negotiations on permanent status throughout interim stages, complemented by a larger, broader context of the Arab Peace Initiative and discussions with the Arab League, and constructive steps that could be unilateral. So by that, we could delineate the boundaries, which is very, very important, because without boundaries, we are talking about what? About the deteriorations towards a binational one state, which is neither the Palestinians' aspiration nor, of course, the Zionist or the Israeli one. And the paradigm that I would suggest for all this is to replace the usual what we had during our times in Camp David and Taba, etc. Nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. I mean, until you fully complete and attain the large-scale, full-scale agreement on Jerusalem, refugees, holy sites, security, and territory, settlements, boundaries, etc., nothing is agreed. I mean, that's not the right paradigm for the next round of negotiations or the next major effort to produce a two-state reality. Now, what needs to be put in place is a paradigm that would say something like the following: whatever is agreed and or coordinated should be implemented. So by that, we create the reality that we want, and we can control the way we are doing it. Now, if you ask me what will be the constructive steps that Israel and the Palestinians could take unilaterally, without negating neither the negotiation process nor the two-state solution at the end of such a process. So for Israel, it could be first a kind of an announcement or statement that it does not have any sovereignty claims eastwards of the security fence or outside of the main settlement blocks that would be incorporated to Israel against a swap of land, etc. in the final agreement. It should be a national scale planning for the relocation and the absorption and the evacuation of those settlers that are living within Palestinian territory, the isolated settlements that are not part of the blocks. Could be legislation of voluntary evacuation and compensation law for those settlers who wish to go. And by the way, let me tell you, there's about 30,000 of them that are ready to go now, subject to being compensated in an adequate and fair manner, an empathic manner. And of course, there is a need for an internal dialogue within Israel on what, and that's completely unilateral. I mean, we don't need the Palestinians for that. We need just the Israelis for that. What would be the character and the identity of this state for the generations to come? Staying in the territories and governing in other people is not one of the virtues or the attributes of such a state. And of course, the Palestinians could also take some steps. Red, you mentioned a few of them. No submission of any claims in international tribunals like the ICC or any other institution like that. Of course, institution building, state building, law enforcement, etc. You don't need us for that. Okay. So this also could be done, and I believe that that this process of producing certain constructive steps that do complement the bilateral and the multilateral negotiations are essential to avoid failure, because failure has a cost. You're right. It has a cost, and we've seen that in the past. We were close to getting an agreement, and the moment it failed, we all got into a circle of horrible bloodshed for 4 years afterwards. So, so for that, I address the U.S. administration here. I believe that a contingency plan should be put in place at the outset and should be complemented by the kind of constructive steps that you can see here on that slide. And I believe that when you have three efforts that go parallel to one another, and one is stuck, the other one goes better and moves ahead, and the third one is still somewhere happening. I mean, there are many trade-offs that Israel can get throughout a multilateral Arab-Israeli track that they cannot get from the Palestinians, because bilaterally we offered, both in 2000, in July 2000, and later on in the Clinton parameters and the Taba talks, and 9 years later or 8 years later, Prime Minister Olmert, former Prime Minister Olmert, offered Mahmoud Abbas an offer that I believe is the best offer that Israel could give. But still, there was no possibility for Abbas to accept it. Then, I don't know why, by the way, maybe you can explain. But that's basically the agreement. So knowing that, what we now have to do is to pave the best way to getting there. Thank you.
Gilad, thank you very much. Marwan.
Jane, Aaron, thank you very much. I'd like to introduce myself as somebody who has worked on the peace process for 20 years and failed, and now I'm working as an analyst. So, as an analyst, I can afford to say things I could not say before. I don't think, also don't think a solution is possible indefinitely. And I think that the two choices that we are faced with today, frankly, are between the difficulty of attempting a solution today and the impossibility of reaching one later. There is, in my opinion, no third option. Waiting for a better time when all the stars will be aligned and somehow a solution is found is, in my view, futile. And I don't want to put a damper on, anyone's views, but I believe 20 years later that just because the two-state solution is the preferred option for all sides doesn't make it happen on its own. It requires a set of conditions and developments for it to happen, other than the wishful thinking of everybody, including me, on whether, such a solution is possible or not. I also don't think that there is a lack of understanding among anyone on the monumental issue that we are facing. As Jane said, certainly President Obama understands it extremely well, both in his Cairo speech in 2008 and in his Jerusalem speech a few weeks or months ago. Secretary Kerry definitely understands it. Only a month ago, he testified on the Hill, and he said that the two-state window is dying. He said he will give it a year, and then as a diplomat, he was a bit more flexible. He said to a year and a half to 2 years. Okay, so Secretary Kerry understands that it's either done in 2 years or it's over. That's his words, not mine. The question is, does the United States have the will to move this understanding to a commitment to do what it takes to make it happen? And that is the big question in my mind. I frankly happen to be extremely skeptical. I hope I'm wrong. But I'm skeptical, not that there is no understanding, not that there is no genuine commitment on Secretary Kerry's part, and I know him very well, and I know that he is committed to doing so. I'm just not sure the White House has this issue as high enough on its priority list to do what it takes. And what it takes is monumental. I will speak about some of this. To do what it takes to, in Secretary Kerry's word, do it in 2 years or face the possibility that it's over. I'm asked to speak about what the Arabs, what would it take to bring the Arabs to the table and keep them there? Again, I'm glad that qualification is there, because it's not a problem getting the Arabs to the table. Okay, the Arabs came to the table many times. Let me remind you of the Annapolis process, where all the Arabs came in Annapolis. The Arab League was there, the Saudis were there, everybody was there. It didn't mean much. Bringing the Arabs to the table is not the issue. The issue is, what does it take to convince the Arabs that this time this is serious, and that this time we are not engaged in yet again another process that I try to sometimes use simple terms and say that Arabs have really come to view this process as sort of similar to two people arguing over a slice of pizza while one of them is eating it. It doesn't work anymore for Arabs, okay? Whether that's a realistic question or not, some people say, well, what alternative do they have? But I'm telling you the Arab frame of mind. Arabs are not interested in another peace process, in another interim steps, in the hope that in the future this will lead to a solution. Let me give you an anecdote. In 2004, 2003, President Bush came to Sharm el-Sheikh first and then to Aqaba to launch the roadmap. And we had a number of Arab leaders there, Mubarak, the Bahraini king, the Palestinian, of course, president, the Jordanian king, etc. And we were I was foreign minister, and we were negotiating the communique that would come out of this meeting. And Colin Powell was there, and Powell was asking the Saudis in particular, as initiators of the Arab Peace Initiative, to agree to interim confidence building steps, okay, not by Egypt and Jordan, but by the Saudis, as a way to move the process forward. Saud said, I'm sorry, we're not interested in this. We're not interested in interim steps. And Powell, this was 3 o'clock in the morning, Powell said, if you insist on your position, then President Bush was not going to come to the meeting the next day, which was at 11 a.m. Saud said, fine. Prince Abdullah will not come either. And sure enough, 11 a.m. comes by, Bush comes, and we wait for 90 minutes. And Prince Abdullah does not show up. 90 minutes later, Condoleezza Rice goes to Prince Saud and said, fine, the president does not want to embarrass the crown prince, we will take it out. They did, and Prince Abdullah showed up. That's the Arab frame of mind. That's the Arab frame of mind. They're not interested in a process. So what does it take for Arabs to come? It's going to take one, convincing them by the president, not by Secretary Kerry, that this time the US is dead serious. Now, dead serious means that the US is going to have to, at some point, present parameters as a basis for negotiations. I'm sorry, but no amount of negotiations, in my opinion, under these conditions is going to result in the Palestinians and the Israelis on their own coming to negotiation. Agreeing on. The Palestinians are divided and weak, and we all know Bibi Netanyahu. He will nickel and dime this process indefinitely if you allow him another negotiations process. He is not interested in a solution. I don't think the current coalition in Israel is interested in a two-state solution for reasons we can talk about. So the United States are going to have to put parameters on the table. Not a full peace agreement, so there's no buy-in. Of course, people have to negotiate the details, but not general enough to keep the current deadlock. They have to be of a specific enough nature, and I agree with Gilad in that we all know what the parameters are, but they have to be specific enough that would allow movement and resolution in a short period of time. The other issue that the Arabs feel very strongly about, and I'm talking about Arabs now in general, is East Jerusalem. You know, if I have to pick one issue of all the issues, whether from refugees to settlements to borders, it's East Jerusalem. This is what Arabs, and particularly the Saudis, who in my view are key to a solution. You're not, of course, having to negotiate with 22 Arab countries. The Saudis are the key to this. It's East Jerusalem. Any solution that does not have East Jerusalem in some way where you would share sovereignty over the city is a non-starter for Arabs. So any solution that keeps Jerusalem exclusively under the sovereignty of Israel is a non-starter for Arabs. They're not going to be interested in that. It's good that the Arab foreign ministers came to Washington. Frankly, don't put a lot of, you know, money on that. I was one of the people who, you know, co-authored the Arab Peace Initiative. It was understood from day one that on the Palestinian front, it is going to involve minor changes to the borders. I mean, after all, the Arab Peace Initiative came 2 years after the Palestinians and the Israelis almost agreed on the borders. So this was no, you know, no surprise to anybody. That's not the case, of course, on the Syrian issue front, but on the Palestinian front, it was always understood that it was going to involve minor modifications to the border. So the fact that they did, you know, okay, fine, for PR reasons, it's good. But it's been a month already, and, you know, we haven't heard from the Israeli side. So I would not really put a lot of emphasis on this. Can it be done in 2 years? I really believe it can. Even with all the difficulties, and certainly the regional situation has made things worse. There is no question about it. Egypt is not interested. You know, Egypt will never abrogate the peace treaty. I am convinced of that. But having said that, they will also are not interested in being seen as proactive on the peace front. Syria, we all know where it is. Saudi Arabia is in a state of transition already. The king is 90 years old, you know. God, Allah yatawwal umrah, he's, you know, at one point he will leave the scene. And once he leaves the scene, you know, the next generation of successors do not have the stature that he does in the Arab world to make this happen. So we don't really have a lot of time. And I think the Saudis are key. And if there is anybody that the United States has to work with, it is on the Arab side, it is the Saudis. Because the Saudis hold the key to the Arab and Muslim states. And if they cannot work with the Saudis at the highest levels, again, at the president's level, if they cannot work, then I'm not sure this can be done. So, in summary, you know, this is all sounding extremely difficult, and it is. But if you compare it, and if you agree with the notion that it is going to be very soon impossible, then maybe the difficult becomes more readily acceptable than now. Thank you very much.
Marwan, thank you very much. I'll be very brief on this. Diplomats and negotiators hate politics, but politics, what you get under what circumstances and how, is critically important to what democratic polities can and cannot do. Barack Obama does not get up every morning and think first about what he's going to do about the Israelis and Palestinians. I think intellectually and even emotionally he understands how important an issue is, how central it is to American credibility and prestige in the region. He does not want to be the American president on whose watch the two-state solution expires. Clearly he does not want to own that. And if Marwan is correct, maybe he is, maybe he isn't, but who wants to take the chance? We may not make it through another 4 years without achieving some kind of critical mass. But governing is about choosing. You have a second-term president, and the clock is ticking down on his presidency. He's a historic president, for sure, and no one will ever be able to take that away from him. Is he a great president? Will he be remembered as a consequential great president? In his own mind, I think he wants to. If his greatness is going to be achieved, I think in his own mind it's going to be achieved with respect to his domestic legacy, which frankly isn't going well. Gun control didn't turn out well. Immigration reform is going to be a much tougher slog. A deal on the budget looks, a big one, looks elusive. You now have 3 other issues. They may not be presidential scandals, they may pass, but for the moment they are substituting for what constitutes energy and politics in this town. And they will be distractions, and all of them together pose certain questions about competency and about supervision with respect to the president, and he owns them all. Whether he wants to or not, he owns them all. The fact that he's not running again, and this to me is an extremely important point because I've looked for precedent in the past 60 years of American diplomacy. Not once have I ever identified an opportunity that a president freed from the political constraints of re-election has decided to take on this particular issue. It's an illusion. It doesn't exist. Bill Clinton went to Camp David, and here's my point. Not because of the absence of political constraint, but because of the presence of political opportunity. It is not the fear of a second-term president of domestic politics that constrains action on this issue. It is the fear of failure, which I would argue drives the same logic both on this end and on this end. It is fear of failure. And that is what constrains Barack Obama, it seems to me, not to mention the other problems in this region. The midterms will approach faster than any of us think. They are important to this president, there's no question. His reset of his relationship with the Prime Minister of Israel, in my judgment, and I'll speak personally here, had much less to do with the peace process and much more to do with removing a gratuitous and needless problem which he's finally addressed. Taking an issue away from the Republicans, reassuring Democrats and the pro-Israeli community that he's not fundamentally anti-Israel. He's now cleared it away. It could work to his advantage if, in fact, there is a serious peace process. But he did not reset his relationship with this particular prime minister in order to go to war with him 3 months later. Absolutely no question that that is not the case. So my final point, right now this peace process, in my judgment, is a John Kerry issue. A talented, able, energetic Secretary of State who believes in this probably more than the president has decided to put himself in the middle of the mix. If he succeeds in moving it along, he will have to then go to his boss and say, I need you. And let me be clear on 2 issues here. It's not a matter of pessimism or optimism. It's a matter of what is required to make this work. The American contribution will have to be made in 2 respects. Number 1, understanding that there needs to be a political horizon here. It's the 20th anniversary of Oslo. Let's not forget. 20 years ago, Israelis and Palestinians tried heroically to do an extraordinary thing, and they didn't succeed. One of the reasons they didn't succeed is because when you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. And a political horizon is critical, whether it's on borders and security. To begin, fine. But that is critical. And second, I agree. I've been in the negotiations. I wish the Israelis and the Palestinians could do it on their own. I really do. I wish reports of meetings between Yasser Abed-Rabbo and the Prime Minister had been borne out and they would have succeeded. But I don't think under these circumstances they can do it on their own. So not only will a political horizon be necessary, but if in fact the president is going to take this on, he's going to have to get in the middle of a negotiation on the issue of a political horizon. And I'm told John Kerry wants an agreement, not a set of parameters that the president would leave, much as Bill Clinton did, behind him. This is about an agreement, which is going to make it even more challenging. So I'll stop now and we will go. First of all, let me just say this. These presentations have been phenomenal, clear, consistent, and truly enormous amount of learning here. And I knew this would happen, and I want to thank the three of you in advance.
Thank you.